I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Hey everybody, it's Chris Bumbray here again with another edition of The Best Movie You Never Saw, and this week we're taking a look at the underrated Jim Carrey dark comedy The Cable Guy, directed by Ben Stiller and co-starring Matthew Broderick, Leslie Mann, George Segal, Jack Black, and Owen Wilson. And in this, Matthew Broderick plays a newly single man stalked by a crazed cable guy played by Jim Carrey, who's bent on becoming his best friend. Now, in the mid-90s, nobody was bigger than Jim Carrey. Ace Ventura: Pet Detective and When Nature Calls, its kinda lame sequel, made him a massive star, and The Mask, Dumb and Dumber, and Batman Forever made him a household name. Every studio in town wanted a piece of Jim Carrey, so Sony ended up paying him $20 million, which was a record back then, to star in The Cable Guy. Everybody was amazed that Jim Carrey, a guy who was unknown 2 years earlier, would suddenly get $20 million to star in a movie. But looking at his box office track record, it was hard to argue that he wasn't worth every penny. Jim Carrey was probably the biggest star of the era. But what nobody knew was that director Ben Stiller and producer Judd Apatow were planning something that was far from your typical Jim Carrey outing. A very dark comedy, the usually wholesome star was recast as something of a nightmare stalker, with his creepy, obsessive side amped up in a way that was bound to alienate his younger audiences. In a way, what happened with The Cable Guy is similar to what happened with Batman Returns. Audiences were lured in with the promise of one movie, but then they resented seeing another, and kids were scared by this distinctly not family-friendly film. Nobody at the time could appreciate how good the movie actually was. They just couldn't get over being lied to by the ads. As a result, after a good opening weekend, The Cable Guy had a huge decline at the box office, only grossing $60 million. Now, that sounds like a pretty good figure for 1996, but for Jim Carrey, that was an absolute disaster. His movies, even on the low end, always grossed at least twice that. The perceived failure was so severe that everyone actually thought that Jim Carrey's career would never recover, only for his next film, Liar Liar, to return him to his family-friendly comfort zone and to become one of his biggest hits ever.
Why don't we just take it from the top?
Here goes. I sped. I followed too closely. I ran a stop sign. I almost hit a Chevy. I sped some more. I failed to yield at a crosswalk. I changed lanes in the intersection. I changed lanes without signaling while running a red light and speeding.
Jim Carrey himself chalked up the failure in a Larry King Live interview to the fact that, more than anything, it was a misconception of what it was going to be.
Too dark? Well, I guess so, but I think more than anything, it was a misconception of what it was going to be. You know, it's like they sold it like it was a light comedy that everybody, you know, whole family, bring your whole family, see Jim jump off a tower in misery. And nobody lost money on it, so it's cool. They didn't. No.
And sure enough, I suppose nobody did lose any money on The Cable Guy. But its reputation was in tatters by the end of the summer of 1996. But while audiences couldn't understand what he was doing in a movie like A Cable Guy back then, considering his body of work since then, it actually feels a lot more in line with what we know about his sensibility than his earlier hits. As much as we liked Ace Ventura, The Mask, and Liar Liar back then, none of them really hold up as well as The Cable Guy, and looking at them now, they don't really feel authentically Jim Carrey. I mean, the Jim Carrey we know is kind of a dark and complicated guy. The Cable Guy is a movie that fits in nicely with his later body of work, movies like The Truman Show, Man on the Moon, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and more. The fact is, pretty much none of his movies from the era hold up as well as The Cable Guy, except maybe Dumb and Dumber. It really helps that the darker Apatow and Stiller aesthetic became in vogue a decade later, making the seem way ahead of its time and really a glimpse of things to come. Some people really did like the movie, with Jim Carrey telling Howard Stern in an interview that the film is still near and dear to me. I talked to Stephen Hawking, to his assistant, and he's one of the smartest men in the universe, and he said that The Cable Guy was a big favorite of his. Now, Jim Carrey's great as Ernie Chip Douglas, the TV-obsessed cable guy bent on making Matthew Broderick's timid everyman his best buddy. He's something of a nightmare caricature with his lisp and omnipresence, but it holds up as one of his classic creations. Clearly he was egged on by Stiller and Apatow, and while the result was probably way too much for a 90s family comedy, it holds up really well close to 25 years later. Wow, 25 years. Suddenly I feel really, really old. It's also worth considering how many of the supporting cast members in this became part of the 2000s era frat pack, from Stiller, who cameos as one of the Menendez brother type criminals in this reality TV spoof that comes and goes throughout the film, and everybody's obsessed with it, to Leslie Mann, who had actually later married Judd Apatow. Owen Wilson also has a nice little cameo as Leslie Mann's blind date, with him getting a pretty vicious beating from Jim Carrey early on in the film, which was a very controversial scene back then. And then there's Jack Black playing it completely straight as Broderick's best buddy. There are a lot of good things in this movie. The musical score is really good. I like the way it quotes movies like North by Northwest. Carrey's performance is insane, but there's also a certain amount of pathos. You kind of relate to him in a certain way. And Matthew Broderick is good as the quote-unquote straight man. I like this movie a lot, and it has some gem moments. I especially like George Segal, who was a great leading man in the 70s and who was making a real comeback at the time in movies like To Die For and on TV in Just Shoot Me as Broderick's kind of overwhelmed father. Later on, he would go, of course, to become famous as the grandfather in The Goldbergs. Now, if you've seen The Cable Guy, you'll know that probably the most famous scene in the movie is the Medieval Times parody, which starts off with Jim Carrey flirting with Janeane Garofalo's waitress, and then ends with him and Matthew Broderick having a duel that quotes the famous Star Trek episode Amok Time, with Jim Carrey even singing along to the Alexander Courage soundtrack. It's a great moment, but for me, probably the best scene in the movie is Porno Password, where Carrey and Broderick play a pretty dirty game with Matthew Broderick's parents, very straight-laced parents.
You know that little thing. No! I can't say that to my mother.
Hey, she's a grown woman. She can handle it.
No, I won't do it. I'm not going to do it. I don't want to play anymore. I've had enough. That's it.
And keep your eyes peeled for a quick, small role by a very young Bob Odenkirk 25 years ago. Look at him. The Cable Guy is pretty widely available if you want to check it out. It's on Blu-ray, it's on DVD, and you can actually check it out for free on Sony's free streaming channel, Crackle. It's another one of those movies who I think's failure was kinda inevitable, but years later, it looks like a secret success. It almost destroyed a couple of careers, and sure enough put Ben Stiller's directing career on ice for a little while. However, everybody bounced back nicely, and only 2 years later, Ben Stiller himself would become a leading man thanks to There's Something About Mary. I feel like if The Cable Guy had been made around the year 2000, Stiller himself probably would have either played Jim Carrey's part or Matthew Broderick's part, and I think it would have gone pretty well. Cable Guy is kind of a minor classic, and a nice preview of things to come both from Jim Carrey and from Judd Apatow and Ben Stiller. Check it out, it's well worth seeing. For JOBLO.com, I'm Chris Bumbray.
Truth, Mr. Sweet. Samuel Jacob Sweet has been found.